Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Saruman, the White Hand, a Grixis Spellslinger deck and one of our donation decks of the week. This deck comes to us from Max Eisenhart, who says, "This is a Spellslinger deck that wants to have creatures on board. I feel that it is currently underrated or underpowered." And in terms of restrictions, they say no tutors and no expensive cards like Jeweled Lotus. Absolutely can work with that restriction. I don't think I've ever suggested Jeweled Lotus. It's not a card I really enjoy. I actually really dislike it, so we're not gonna be too worried about this. I think this deck is really fun. Thank you for sending it, Max, and I'm excited to get right into it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Saruman the White Hand, and why are they our Grixis Spellslinger commander? Saruman the White Hand is Saruman in his industrial phase, a 4-mana Grixis that's black, blue, red, Avatar Wizard 2/5. They have two abilities. One's actually they're both kind of statics, but whenever you cast a non-creature spell, amass Orcs X, where X is that spell's mana value. Of course, amassing is you check if you have an army token. If you do, you now put the X amount of +1/+1 counters, and if the army wasn't an orc before, it's now additionally an orc. And if you don't have an army, you just create an army token and put the +1/+1 counters. And finally, the other static is orcs and goblins you control have Ward 2. I read that backwards. This is a pretty interesting, pretty straightforward commander that works as a young pyromancer, if you're familiar, a creature that generates tokens as you cast spells, specifically non-creature spells, which is the best wording, because sometimes it just says instants and sorceries. The thing about it, there is a bit of a goblin and orc kindred element to it by giving your creatures, your goblins and orcs, all Ward 2. That being said, it works kind of differently than how we perceive most young pyromancer or token spellslinger decks work, where instead of going wide, you go tall. And Saruman himself doesn't really do much to boost the power of the other goblins, just giving them a very nice layer of protection. So with that in mind, we are building a half, kindred deck and half of a spellslinger deck. Looking at the deck itself, I'm pretty happy with the direction it is. We can see we have 36 lands including MDFCs, 35 otherwise. Our curve is pretty nice. We're kind of high on the 4 mana, and I feel like we go a bit further down, but otherwise I think it's very good. There's a lot of really fun kind of mechanics here, such as Changeling Outcast being an army, so it can grow very big and be unblockable, or just using a bunch of very powerful like magecraft abilities like Archmage Emeritus every time. I'm reminded repeatedly every time from friends that this is a type of wizard, and that's why it sounds like a name, but it's not. So it's not a legendary creature. And then we have a bunch of really good low mana, interactive spells at instant, and a bunch of kind of also interactive spells, but payoffs as well in sorceries. So overall, I do like it. But there are a few directions I would like to improve the deck with. First of all, let's do the thing I like to do and look at our 4-drops. 4-drops are a bit higher than I'd like it to be. Remember, this is the same mana cost as our commander, and if we can help it, I would like to cut some pieces out of there, because these cards are going to compete with our commander in terms of the spell we cast when we have 4 mana. But in addition, and I think that's very important here, these spells will also compete with casting 2 mana spells. Now, for a lot of, like our 4 mana spells, you might say, well, casting 1 4 mana spell and amassing 4, and casting 2 mana spells and amassing 2 each time, that adds up to the same. And I agree with that. But for certain cards we might have, such as Goblin Electromancer, Nightscape Familiar, or anything that will generate tokens on cast, but not based on the mana cost, it gets better to cast 2 spells, right? Reducing 1 spell to 3 a four mana spell to 3 or two 2-mana spells to 1, which one is better, right? It gets us a little more bang for our buck, it gets us a little more effects, and our magecraft abilities are better. So that's also only counting our non-creature spells. We can see the majority of our 4 drops are creatures themselves. So even then, that whole thing I just explained doesn't really always apply. So let's do a bit of a look here. So Archmage Emeritus I think is good enough, definitely a very strong card and worth keeping. Cormella Glamour Thief is a card I personally really don't like. I recognize it generates 2 additional mana, it fixes colors, and I do like that. But when I think about a card that generates 2 additional mana, right, I'm thinking of like Worn Power Stone. That's a 3-mana artifact that generates 2 not colored mana. Or we can think of like a number of those 4-mana artifacts that tap for 2. Even better than this would be like Thran Dynamo that taps for 3. So as a mana rock, she's not particularly good. In fact, obviously, as one knows, those spells, that mana can only be spent on instants and sorceries. And I don't see that being as good. Also, the super restrictive colors of the card, like we can see the majority of our cards tend to be red and blue and very rarely black. Like there's going to be some setups that are really nice, like this mana will cast Perplex very, very well. However, this mana will not cast Saruman's Trickery. You will need an additional blue. So it feels like already we have a bunch of, hoops to jump through. And then finally, her death trigger that just returns an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to hand is hard to control in this deck. And though I'm going to probably suggest something that allows you to do that, even then, I don't think that's good enough. I feel like she's clunky, she's a setup card, and in order for that haste to be valuable, you need a total of 5 mana, right? You need to be able to use that ability right away. Or you could just attack with her, but I don't know to what degree I particularly like that. So you need 5 mana to then generate 3 mana. Like, is this your 5 mana play? I really don't see it. I do think if she was just a little cheaper, maybe produce less mana, like just a more traditional mana dork, the setup wouldn't be that bad. But at this point, at 4 mana, 5 mana if you want to use her right away, I don't particularly like her. After that, we've got Corsairs of Umbar. I kind of like this, but once again, at the 4 mana, I think it loses a lot of its power. It's got some interesting things to it. It's a mana sink. I like when it deals damage, it amasses orcs, which also works with our theming. But beyond all of that, it doesn't work. It doesn't gain like ward. It doesn't work with our other synergies. And though it can give itself like, how many things can it actually make unblockable? I know this is for the orc army, but I think I'd rather like an instant or sorcery that can do that. Whereas there's just going to be certain creatures that, we can't give that unblockability to, nor do we really care, right? Like there's a certain point when you have like a 10-10 army that you might just be happier holding up like counter magic rather than spending your last 3 mana to make it unblockable, right? Because that 10-10 smashing turn after turn, even though it might not end the game as fast, you are less likely to run into removal if you could at least, float the idea that you have counter magic. So Corsairs, I feel, is a little weak for the deck. God Eternal Kefnet, I think, is fine. I'm not so much a fan of this card, but I will say, like, when it's good, they're very, very good, but when they're bad, they're just okay. So let's talk about the good. The good is that this is a 4/5 flyer that has a pretty reasonable ability in a deck that's mainly instants and sorceries. The mana reduction is cool, and it's a fun creature, and the fact that it can't really be killed is also very powerful. But what's the bad? The bad is if we look through our instants and sorceries, we actually have not a crazy amount, especially in instants, that will be reduced meaningfully, right? And there's some that will be reduced that you just can't do anything with, like Arcane Denial, or like Saruman's Trickery or Perplex, all of which that don't even get the full reduction. When you reveal a counter spell, right? Like you exile this counter spell, you have to use it this turn, right? Oh, I'm sorry. I misread how this works, but it's still, my point still stands, but I got this backward. It copies the card, it doesn't reduce the cost of it. So anything that's a counter magic is just useless because there's going to be no spells on the stack. So a number of cards just don't work. In addition, something I don't particularly like about this card in these kind of shells is the fact that this ability, the second one, is really, really cool until you recognize that you're going to have to keep casting it, right? 4 mana like every few turns is not free in a deck that wants to cast 2 to 3 spells. You can't really reduce it. It doesn't make armies or like anything else on ETB, so you have to like, because when you cast God Eternal Kefnet, you've already drawn 90% of the time, right? You don't have flash here, but because of that, you can't use it for a turn cycle, and if it dies, you've just basically burned through 4 mana for nothing. That's not even including like the other ways you can remove it, like shuffling it into your deck. Bouncing it is the same, but still not a card I'm really too impressed with. It's a very cool card. Maybe if you can like manipulate the top of your deck and the like, but here I think it's a little clunky. Grima Saruman's Footman, I think, is here for flavor reasons because it's Grima Wormtongue, but I'm just gonna skip through this and say this just isn't very, very good. This is a theft card that you have no control over, and you might get something good, you might get something bad. In the meantime, it is a 4 mana investment for a 1/4, and you have to attack with it and you have to hit with it, which even with the blocked, can't be blocked, doesn't mean it's going to hit. Like, there's a lot of things here that I don't particularly like and feels very, very clunky for a card that's actually kind of cool. And to be honest, I feel this way about a lot of the black-blue thief kind of mechanics, like stealing cards from opponents, where it needs to be kind of pushed, because a good percentage of the time, these cards are very much so held back. Like, think of how Grima Saruman's Footman would be just so much better if it was like an ETB, or triggered at end step, or triggered on your post-combat main phase. Anything like that would make it just dramatically better instead of having this can't be blocked and then combat damage. It just makes it a very clunky creature. So with that in mind, I think this just doesn't fit what we're doing outside of flavor. So if you keep them for the flavor, I won't fault you, but I will say I'm not too impressed with this card. Kess, I think, is great, works here very well, works as a backup commander should you want to change, but not entirely, but still, Kess is fine, no problems here. Krenko, I think, is a great addition, works very, very well, gives you a very nice aggro out in a way that your opponents will not be, expecting. I might want, it'd be really nice to have some haste enablers here. Like, even Lightning Greaves would be enough, because the ability, if you could grab Krenko Mob Boss and immediately tap him down, you would feel really, really good about it and get this huge advantage. Whereas if you play Krenko and then you kind of just hang around for a turn, your opponents are going to be wise of what you're doing and kind of interfere with your plan. That being said, you do have the means to protect Krenko, so it's not too bad, but still, it's not ideal. Mana Form Hellkite. I think this is a card I have a lot of problems with. I think this card is cool, right? I think this is really interesting. It turns your creatures immediately into damage with evasion your non-creature spells, as long as your opponents don't have flyers, your opponents can be attacked, they don't have propaganda effects, and you do this pre-combat or on your last opponent's end step, right? Because it is next end step, it is not your end step. So it is fair that you can use these to block in interesting ways, but generally the problem is going to be is you have to be very specific of when you cast these, and even then, they're not going to do that much damage, right? Because most of these are going to come out as 2/2s or 3/3s, and then you don't get to keep them, unlike the army tokens or young pyro tokens. These creatures are going to come out, hopefully they're going to hit, and if not, they're just going to evaporate. Once again, I'm going to suggest something to do with them before they evaporate, but still, this is a tough one. I really think it's cool, but at the 4 mana cost, in addition to everything else that I think is holding this card back, I would definitely remove it. Obviously, Saruman's our commander. Looking at our instants and sorceries, generally these are fine. Surrounded by the orcs feels cute. I just don't think this is going to be relevant. Milling an opponent's deck, let's say by 20, let's be really, really optimistic, is only meaningful if you can do it 4 more times. So what you're going to do most likely is mill someone. Hopefully you won't help them, because the majority of players have, you know, some kind of strategy that really revolves around the graveyard. And all you're doing is putting 3+1/+1 counters on your orc pile, right? And with that in mind, if I were just going to look at putting 3+1/+1 counters on an army token, that's like 3 proliferates, or like a green spell that puts counters, or a black spell that puts counters. That's like 1 to 2 mana, I think. This being 4 mana is just ridiculous, and I think is a very, very easy cut. Widespread Brutality is great. Contact Other Plane is not good. I do appreciate it is an instant draw 2 that is half the time better, but even then, 4 mana, I don't know. I really don't like this. I do appreciate that it's an instant spell, but I would rather these be 3 mana. I'm going to suggest some black 3 mana draw that I think is just going to be a little better. But I will admit that if you can roll the scry 2 draw 2, it's pretty good. And if you hit that 20, yeah, that's great, but we don't really look at these cards that way. But at half the time, it just being like an instant speed divination at 1 extra mana, not great, I will say. Ferric Blast is it's a fling. It's a fling that draws you a card. I don't think that's worth the 4 mana. I think I would rather the fling or the thud that you have in your sideboard, because it's just less mana. And I do appreciate that, like, this will generate a 4/4 army token, but you can't sack that token. Like, you have to sack your army token, you hit something, and then you draw a card and create a 4/4 army token. So with your commander out, it's kind of a good deal, but without your commander, or generally, and if this gets countered especially, this is just not an ideal card, I will say. So I would just rather the ones being lower to the ground. Generally, you're more excited to have bodies than exactly care at the difference, and thud or fling, I would probably say fling is good enough instead. Finally, Relic of Sauron is great. Before we go to additions though, I did want to talk a little bit about the higher mana stuff. A few of them I'm gonna call out as cards that I don't really like here. For example, Extract from Darkness. I think it's just because it's in the commander deck. It is a 5 mana reanimation spell that I just don't particularly feel is good enough. It's just fine. It doesn't really do what we want to do. We're not really meaningfully reanimating things from our graveyard or our opponent's graveyard. We just have to get lucky. And at 5 mana, I don't want to just get lucky. All will be one I think is really, really cute, and I do really like it here. And we have a number of enchantments, like we have All will be one, Arcane Bombardment, and Storm of Saruman. These are all 5 mana and higher enchantments that are kind of like, not win more, but I guess they are win more. They're not win more, they're just win, right? Like these are the payoffs of your deck to do what you wanted them to do. And I think 3 is probably too much. All will be one, I think, is the strongest of these, of the whole cycle, because it works so interestingly with the deck. It works really, really well with the Ozolith. Like, it has a really nice flavor to it, and it's the lowest mana one, so that catches my eye. Arcane Bombardment is cool. I think it requires a lot of setup, and therefore is just a lot weaker than the other two. Like, Storm of Saruman is just really, really cool and has a really high payoff, and it comes with wards, so I think this is the strongest of them. And All will be one is the other strongest, so Arcane Bombardment kind of stands out as the one I'd cut out of there. Otherwise, looking at the other 2 very high mana, or let's say 3 high mana cards in instants and sorceries, Subjugate the Hobbits, I feel like is going to feel really cool when it works, and just okay when it doesn't. Maybe I'd prefer something in the red zone where you can steal them for 1 turn, if that's going to be less like mob something. Let's look that card up. Mob Mob is a favorite of mine, but I'm looking at Mob Rule. So for 6, gain control of all creatures, power 4 or greater, and they gain haste, or 3 power or less. Comparing that to this, which is 7 mana, and you can immediately attack with the Mob Rule, it's close. The reason I kind of like Mob Rule more is because you immediately get the, you use it to win the game, whereas Subjugate the Hobbits, you also can use to win. Like, I think the correct way to use this card is to steal everything and attack with the rest of your creatures. And if you're going to do it just to win, why not use the one that costs 1 less mana and allows you to attack with those creatures, right? And that's not even including the fact that Mob Rule can steal commanders, and Mob Rule has a second mode where you can get the bigger creatures instead of the smaller creatures. So with that in mind, I don't really love Subjugate the Hobbits, even though it can be incredibly powerful in the right pod. Oops. Then Call Forth the Tempest, right? That's the last, oh yeah, second last one. This one I think is really, really cool, but at the same time, I don't think this is the deck that wants this. I think the ceiling of this card is very, very strong in Cascade decks or decks that aim to cheat out spells. And here, with the number of our cards that are removal or counter magic, I don't like it as much. If we were more proactive, like if we took a bunch of the counters out, went more into the fling route, went more into like the value token creation route, I think I would really like Call Forth the Tempest. But right now at 8 mana, being able to whiff is kind of fine. And then even then, what happens here? Like, we use this as a... So the problem is that, so the counter spells not only can you not cast the counter spells you flip off of this, you can't get the benefit by not casting them. So that makes those particularly worse. But even if you do cast 2 or 3, like another 2 spells that are low mana, all you get is like a one-sided board wipe out of 8 mana. So you're really using this to cast 3 spells, right? Because a board wipe that's one-sided, you could use just black board wipes or something else and you'd be happier. So you're doing this to cascade mainly. And without the value plays, I don't know. I don't like it. I think you can definitely keep this. This is a very cool card, but I think the deck needs to be kind of massaged into making this work, right? The current setup doesn't allow for this. Last one I just wanted to mention before we go here, Commence the Endgame. This is a 6 mana divination. This is a card I really like in one-on-one, especially like, I think it might still be in my cube, I'm not sure, but in multiplayer, I don't like it because you're just drawing 2 and then making like a 7/7, 8/8, 9/9. And that is just not as valuable in a 4-player game. This is a lot of mana, whereas at this amount of mana, you should be drawing 4 to 5 cards, I would say. Or, you know, drawing cards and setting up an even bigger board. Like this, if you have your commander out, this should create like a 13/13, which is much better, but is still like susceptible to all of the hate, all of the removal, all of the interaction that everything else has. So, and without your commander, it's just kind of fine. So at 6 mana, I really think this is too much. I think if you hold up mana all turn, like what's the dream, right? You're holding up mana, you hold up 6 mana, there's a turn cycle going around, somebody attacks you, you slam Commence the Endgame, it can't be countered, so you're going to draw your 2 cards, and then you make like a 14/14 zombie, maybe even more if you already have the army, and then you block. Is that really worth it? Like, you could have just used the 2 mana removal spell, right? If that was the problem. And now you're completely tapped out, so your other opponents know that they can attack into you or do something else, or they have all the information in a deck whose main power, I would say, is your ability to hold up so many really good spells. So this might be like a higher level thinking, but like, or higher power level, I should say. But this card reduces your ability to play well. Maybe that's something I should talk about sometime. That's an interesting thought. I'm going to keep that in mind. All right, let's go to additions. So the one card that I think is almost like a crime not to put in is Gutter Snipe. Gutter Snipe is already such a good Spellslinger card, and the fact that they're a goblin, is even better. The fact that they're a goblin and the ward 2 of it is even better. Like, Krenko getting the ward 2 is really nice because it increases the ability for you to untap with them, but Gutter Snipe doesn't require an untap. You play Gutter Snipe and then you can cast 2 to 3 spells and immediately start doing damage, so that ward is instantly important, right? And very, very useful. So Gutter Snipe, I think, is the best inclusion. If you take one, take Gutter Snipe. Stormkiln Artist is a card that also keeps getting reprinted, which I really like, but not a goblin, but really, really good in Spellslinger. Basically turns every single one of your spells into 1 additional mana, which with mana reducers and other things can eventually get you casting multiple spells over and over again and just keep going, which is really, really strong. Not even adding to the fact that this creature can attack, and in a deck with so much removal interaction, getting Stormkiln Artist to attack is actually really reasonable, so a very easy inclusion there. On a similar vein of a dwarf that likes treasure, we've got Magda the Hoardmaster, and I think this is one of the best shells for a card like this, where once again you're running so well, like you're running so hot on interaction that it's really, really easy to trigger Magda multiple times in a turn cycle. And then, like, even with Stormkiln Artist or otherwise, turning those treasures into, you know, dragons, which once again, like, it's not exactly the what you're doing with the orc armies, but it's close enough that it's on theme, and I think really, really powerful. Also, just even if you don't turn them into dragons, getting treasures building up and slowly ramping that way, I think is going to be very, very good. It's just, you're not playing Young Pyromancer. I don't think this needs to be added, but I thought I'd still say, like, if you are going to play one in 3 colors, Young Pyromancer is always accessible. There is also the Third Past Iconoclast, which is an Izzet and is non-creatures, but you're not that deep into enchantments and artifacts that I think it's fine to just play Young Pyromancer. It just puts a few more bodies on board, but gives you blockers, gives you some meaningful attacks, lets you do things with them, that we'll see in a second, and I think you're going to be pretty happy with that. The opportunity cost of running Young Pyro is very, very low. Something else that I saw, and this is a commander I think about a lot, Anhello the Painter. Anhello is really, really interesting because this is a Spellslinger commander that uniquely works really well with Saruman and what the deck wants to do, right? In order, what Anhello says, the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn has casualty 2, which means you'll get a copy if you sacrifice a 2-power creature or greater. And your deck has the means of creating 2-power tokens very, very often using Saruman or using amass triggers and other things. So the ability to get a copy of their first spell is actually really, really accessible. And unlike your other cards or other copy cards, Anhello is just 3 mana, which is really, really nice, and a 1/3 Death Touch, which is a pretty good blocker in a pinch. So I think this is a pretty easy inclusion and a fun one. The mana is a bit tough if you're not going to be able to get it or to be able to cast him on turn 3, but I still think he's rather good. He's dead, right? I'm pretty sure he got Phyrexianized. Rest in peace. I've alluded to this card a few times. Goblin Bombardment, I think, is particularly good here. I could say Impact Tremors as well, but I think Goblin Bombardment is just a bit better. Gives you something to do with all of the tokens you're going to be generating when they might just be, you know, removed through blocks, removed through attacks, removed through, you know, board clears, pings. There's just so many ways for your, like, small tokens to die, and Goblin Bombardment just turns them into a little bit of damage that can be targeted at opponents' creatures. And I think that will be an incredibly powerful play where you can cast, like, you know, you cast some spells to generate some bodies, and then you use those bodies to kill more creatures so that the army token can get in. And for those who don't know, the best way to use this with army tokens is you cast a lot of small spells. This is like with Orcish Bowmaster usually, that every time the trigger to create another army goes on the stack is you sacrifice the original army, so it works more like Young Peasy, where it keeps making 1/1s as opposed to growing a single 1/1 taller and taller, and that way you get so many Goblin Bombardment triggers that you wouldn't get otherwise. So very, very good card, and I very much so suggest it. Going to draw, I have a few cards here for card draw that I think are worth running, because I do see that your deck is kind of lacking in card draw, you have a lot of very efficient low to the ground spells, but it feels like after you've burned out all of your mana, and cards countering spells or interacting, you're kind of low. And so having things like Night's Whisper, which is really cheap and easy to draw, or Rowan's Grim Search, which is really, really good here as you can sacrifice the army tokens or any other tokens to get the full effect, are going to be very, very powerful. Not directly a draw card, but at the same mana cost, Sauron's Ransom I think is very, very good here. I like that it's on theme, but also it allows, it is a value instant play on your opponent's turn that doesn't really require you to have too much, whereas Rowan's Grim Search requires you to have a token to sacrifice, Sauron's Ransom can just easily be thrown out on your last opponent's end step before your turn and, get you some kind of card advantage. That allows you to just get ahead a little further. Also, the ring tempting you is cute. I just don't think it's going to be very relevant, but still cute. At 4 mana, which I know we're supposed to avoid 4 mana, but this is a pretty easy exception, Big Score. Big Score I think is going to be particularly good here as another draw spell, even though you are neutral on cards, you drop 2 and you gain 2, but getting 2 treasure tokens is often very, very good and allows you to go into the next turn with more mana. I still think you cast Saruman before you cast Big Score, but it's worth considering that this card, by generating mana, allows you to double spell that turn, so you could Big Score. If an opponent casts a spell and you want to dig for counter magic, Big Score is really nice because it generally will give you the mana to cast that counter magic after and hopefully help you draw into it at the same time. So I think this is really good here. Last 2 cards, Retribution of the Ancients is something in your sideboard. I just wanted to point it out and say this is a very, very good card, and I think works really, really well with army tokens. It is mana intensive for a deck that is lower on black mana, but considering you can just use it once a turn cycle to kill 1 creature in exchange for your army tokens, I think that's going to be very, very good. So I would definitely play this. It is a bit of a tricky kind of card to work when you don't have your commander or you don't have any reasonable army generation, but when you do, it's going to feel very, very good. And I think it's fine as a quote-unquote win more, because win more cards at 1 mana that are still, likely to do something at least once, I think are pretty good. Finally, it's coming. Lightning Bolt. We are in red, we are Spellslinger, we should be playing Lightning Bolt. It is an immensely powerful card, and honestly, if you have the means, Rapid Hybridization and Pongify, which would be the other one, are in your colors and incredible removal spells that I think would work really well here. I didn't realize Pongify just got reprinted, so that's even cheaper, and in the Modern Horizons 3 Commander. Pick them up while you can, because this card does tend to lean back up in price, and so I think it is very, very good. And that's it for my thoughts of the deck. Thank you so much, Max, for sending this. I really do like what you're doing here, and I do think Saruman is a particularly strong commander for this kind of deck. So yeah, I think I'd like to see more, and I want to, if you make another draft, send it my way, but let me know also if this, if these additions and changes are what you were looking for. All right, good luck and happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.